everyone, and welcome to the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies Spring Conference 2021, Psychical and Spiritual. We are delighted to see so many of you here today. So it falls to me now to introduce our first speaker, and we are absolutely delighted to have Right Reverend Martin Shaw with us today to give us our first address. Martin has long been a member and a patron of the fellowship. Until his retirement, he was Bishop of Argyll and the Isles, and now lives and works as an assistant bishop in Exeter. So Martin, you are very welcome here. Thank you for sharing with us. You will see that his name appears to be Beatrice. I assure you it isn't. So Martin, over to you. Thank you very much.
Good morning to you, everybody. It's lovely to be with you. I think it's a great name to be called Beatrice, actually, because am I not right in saying it is Beatrice that ensures that Dante gets his way through hell and purgatory in order to get into heaven? And so I could not be identified with a bit better person, really. But the reason why it's there is because my granddaughter sometimes uses this computer, so that's her name. Anyway, so thank you for that. Can I just begin with using a George Herbert poem as a prayer, really, because I think it has the heart of the psychical with the spiritual, which is the heart of what I want to share with you. This is one of the poems that was used in a remarkable music collection of Vaughan Williams called The Five Mystical Songs. And this is one of them. I got me flowers to straw thy way. I got me boughs off many a tree. But thou wast up by break of day and brought'st thy sweets along with thee. The sun arising in the east, though he give light and the east perfume. If he should offer to contest with thy arising, they presume. Can there be any day like this, though many suns to shine endeavor? We count 300, but we miss. There is but one, and that one ever. I would argue one outside, of course, the passion and resurrection narrative in the Gospels themselves, of course, I would argue one of the greatest poems about the resurrection that I know, really. Some would probably contest that, as it were, if I can use the word. But I want to continue with the theme of music, if I may. But before I do, I must just talk about how I got into that CFPSS. It's very important. It's through that, forgive me if I'm being very disloyal to the poor man, but it was my initial experience of him, which was of Martin Israel. And my first experience of him was hugely terrifying because he wasn't, in fact, the most social creature under the sun. And when you actually went up to speak to him, and some people remember him well, he had a habit of standing at an angle away from as if you've got bad breath. I don't know if you actually could have experienced that in many ways. And I was asked by the Bishop of Exeter, because I used to work here years ago, this is rather comic really, whether I would be the diocesan deliverance officer. Used to be called exorcist. Thank goodness that was stopped. And anyway, which I agreed rather foolishly. And I thought I'd better learn a little bit about the background of this. So I got in touch with Martin Israel, whom I'd obviously read some of his books. And I went up to his flat in London. And I arrived early, 2 minutes early, and he opened the door and said, "You're early, please sit out there in the chair until it's time." Well, 2 minutes to go. Anyway, dead on the time, he beckoned me in to sit in his front room. This is before, by the days of answering machines and mobiles, by the way. And we sat down, and he first of all started by saying, "Now tell me about your prayer." So I talked about the daily office. I talked about I said, I wasn't asking that. I was talking about your prayer. So I said, well, I try to use the Fellowship of Meditation Center. No. I'm asking about your prayer, your praying. Would that improve matters? I want you to know about the quality of your praying. Now, how on earth do you answer that question? Anyone answers that question needs their heads tested, let alone their hearts. Anyway, I fumbled away, and he said, it's really important that you believe that your prayer is powerful because you're ordained, and that's what it's ordained for, but it is undergirded by humility and a constant sense of your need for forgiveness. The phone went, and the phone was on the mantelpiece behind him, sorry. He got up and answered it and said, hello, 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 hello. And then he turned to me and said, Martin, please stand. And I'm the other side of the room, so I stood. And he said, yes, no, St. Patrick's breastplate is what you need. Christ be with me. Join in, Martin, please join in. Christ be with us. So we went through St. Patrick's breastplate. And at the end of it, when he said amen, there was no bye-bye or anything. He just put the phone down and sat down and said, now, where were we? About your praying. And I see you don't know the St. Patrick's breastplate by heart. That's the first thing you have to do, learn it by heart. So I was, by this time, as you can understand, quite nervous. Anyway, I said, do you mind me asking, Martin, who you were praying for? It's none of your business. So you don't need, your prayer is what matters, not actually prurient excavating into somebody else's disease. Just do you not trust me? So I learned a huge, and although that sounds rather fierce, I went away and listened to it, and it's actually been with me ever since that. And when I came down, he told me to get in touch with a wonderful lady who many of you will remember, called Barbara Bunce, who died, I think I'm right in saying, about 2 or 3 years ago. Wonderful person. And Barbara Bunce, of course, was on the council, of course, of CFPSS, as all of you know. Anyway, Barbara and Bunce and I worked for years together, and so that was brought me into the CFPSS, and it was just and it has been a wonderfully important experience. So there you go, that's me. In the magnificent, curious, and disturbing world of Richard Wagner's operas, there are 4 music dramas that make up what is known as the Ring of the Nibelungen, das Ring der Nibelungen. Each of them is uniquely distinct from the others, and yet there are common motifs that trace through all 4. The 4 music dramas, I emphasize, are distinct, but not separate, hence the title of my paper, Spiritual and Psychical Experience, Separate or Distinct. In the 4 music dramas of Wagner, there is no disconnect, no separation between them. The music, the philosophy, and indeed the art have that characteristic commonality, rootedness, through the unifying genius of Richard Wagner, along with the mythology which inspired him. No matter what you think of his philosophy and his anti-Semitic politics. Now, I have a question about the title of our fellowship. To go straight to the heart of the matter here, the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies, as we have it. The word separate as a verb has the dictionary meaning of divide or disconnect. The word distinct is subtly different. It can be used, again, as some dictionaries show, as a synonym for separate. However, on closer inspection, the word distinct does not imply a disconnect or division. The question I have is this: unless there's some care taken, are not the words psychical and spiritual, when used about our experience, suggesting that there is a separation, a disconnection between the two, psychical and spiritual? Whereas if the words are seen as distinct, there's almost an organic commonality to them, a rootedness. Although there are those of you who might want to be clear about the spiritual and the psychical being separate, there are some dangers, it seems to me. Christian spirituality, a term more noted perhaps inevitably for its unclarity than for its clarity, might assume that the spiritual is the experience of living the Christ-like life. I can't think of a better definition than that of spirituality, which is living the Christ-like life. Indeed, perhaps in a rather foolhardy way, I might try and describe that life as costly, even as a sacrificial loving of the other, whoever that other may be, based on a committed and disciplined life of praying as an obedient listening to God. And remember, the word obedience, ob audiri, comes from two words. It means deep, deep listening and adapting to and adopting what you're listening to. That's what obedience means. Indeed, the 19th century Saint Jean Vianney, the Curé d'Ars, in his single-hearted simplicity, encouraged his parishioners in that village of Dar to practice the Christian life with two basic dynamics that, in his view, were all that was needed. 1, praying. 2, sacrificial loving. Pray, love. What else is there? When these two are present, then Christ is present. No matter what circumstances you're in, or how you define them, psychical or spiritual. The psychical, some of you might contend, doesn't necessarily indicate or even suggest the presence of the Christ-like life. The word psychical has an assumption behind it, that the psychical is that which is beyond or apparently beyond the physical. In spiritualism, a perplexing spin on the word spirituality, the psychical can assume a connection to another world, a connection which often produces so-called spiritualistic phenomena, or we might say psychical phenomena. Such phenomena don't necessarily suggest the presence of praying and loving. In fact, it doesn't suggest to any other religious culture that there is any connection to something which is fundamentally spiritual, let alone psychical. Indeed, Freudian theory uses the term psychic determinism, by which Freud meant that mental processes are always determined by motivations, conscious or unconscious. Experiencing Christ's presence came to me, perhaps rather indirectly, but nevertheless intensively, through the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola, when I made an 8-day retreat at St. Byno's in North Wales some 20 or so years ago. Some of you will have been there, or have not been there. You probably have made the exercises in one form or another. The exercises were designed not just to open the way to an intense and subjective experience of Christ, but to raise spiritual seeing in the praying through the exercises, in Ignatius' words, finding God in all things. Not finding God in some things, but all things. So if the world of the spiritual is experiencing Christ here and now and finding God in all things, here and now, there are no experiences, not even psychical ones, that are outside the spiritual. However, they might be distinct. So let's go deeper into this word, distinct. One of the growing insights among contemporary writers in the theological roots of Christian spirituality is a challenging of dualism, D-U-A-L-I-S-M, which is, if you like, the separation created by that which is described as spiritual and that which is described as pragmatic or practical. Oh, he's a very spiritual person. I'm a practical person. You've heard that nonsense spoken many all over the place. This separation, you know, the Martha and Mary, completely misunderstanding that gospel story, of course. This separation becomes clear in how the words good and evil, dark and light are used. That then develops more destructively, in my view, into a separation of those who are in and those who are out. And I'm sure you can add many such separations and dualisms to your list. Dualism is an all too constant human flaw, a perennial distortion, if you like. But the world is not binary. It isn't clear-cut, uncomfortable as that may be. Establishing certainty about anything is beyond us. Although I can hear the voice, maybe it's a psychical one, of Blaise Pascal in his wonderful memorial saying, I have Christ, certainty, certainty, certainty. But I think if you've read Blaise Pascal's Pensées, you will see even in those words, a kind of protesting a little too much. Thus, to separate the spiritual and the psychical is to fall back into dualism, the dangers of which are all too obvious in history, where there are those inside the spiritual and those outside. All of us in a fellowship would surely maintain that the Christ-like life is dedicated and first and foremost to the outsiders, precisely to the outsiders. Or as Richard Holloway rightly points out in his recent book, Stories We Tell Ourselves, the word poor in the gospel is more accurately translated as expendable. The fellowship is here for the expendables. Finding God in all things is the disturbing corrective, our poisonous attraction to the exclusive. I love belonging to an exclusive club. I can go in to a bishop's meeting and feel, I was about to say comfortable, but that wouldn't be true. The danger of the fellowship is to see our experience of the psychical and the spiritual as giving us particular power. To faith, add knowledge, as the letter of James has it. And it is there, of course, in the logo of the CFPSS. But that does not turn us into some band of esoteric initiates. The thinly veiled suggestion that we have knowledge and experience that you don't is a dangerous one. Whereas powerlessness is where the Christ-like life is lived and experienced. That's our spiritual touchstone. St. Paul puts it powerfully in his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 1, verses 27. But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And God has chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. After all, we are ourselves, as Paul would put it, expendables. There's a slight irony in giving you that quote, because there is, if you like, a dualism there between the foolish and the wise, isn't there? Probably we can never get away from it. By now, I hope you're beginning to see that psychical experiences or phenomena are within the spiritual. Distinct, yes, but not separate. Let me try to unfold this a little more. In 1974, I went on a retreat to the community of the Holy Name, which used to have its mother house in Malvern Link. Some of you may remember it. A friend of mine, Sister Carol, a religious of that community, on the day before I left to return home, took me out to see Tewkesbury Abbey, which is one of the finest examples of Norman architecture in England. Since that visit, the one-time Benedictine Abbey has remained of vital importance to me, as it is truly a holy place, steeped in prayer. As T.S. Eliot would put it, where prayer has been valid. We arrived at the door just before the abbey was due to be closed and locked for the day. A dark and dreary evening. The key-clad verger said he would give us 20 minutes, generous man. This leniency, I suspect, was owing to Sister Carol's nun's habit. Even skeptical and cynical vergers succumb sometimes. I went into the St. Margaret's Chapel of Tewkesbury Abbey, where the Blessed Sacrament is reserved, in a beautiful hanging pyx, and I waited in silence. Now, to that point, I had found my retreat at the convent to be next to useless, or so I thought. No sense of the presence of Christ, let alone experience of being loved by him. The notes I took during the retreat were, to borrow the title of Malcolm Muggeridge's autobiography, chronicles of wasted time. However, the art of waiting in this chapel somehow was given to me. As I sat there after a while, I could hear the organ playing, not altogether surprising in a beautiful building like Tewkesbury Abbey. And I knew the piece that was being played, Jean Anna's Litanie, a piece of electrifying poignancy that repeats the same musical phrase over and over with different colors and emphases. A litany, just to remind you, is a form of liturgical praying, not unlike the Jesus prayer, mostly repeating a short sentence over and over again, allowing the praying to drop down into the unconscious. A door of perception was given to me at that moment on the back of my waiting, which turned out to be the most significant aspect of my retreat. As we were leaving the Abbey, I said to the verger that I would like to thank the organist who had given me such a gift. The verger looked puzzled and said that the organist was on holiday and the organ hadn't been played all day. Now, the inexplicable phenomenon of the organ playing with no organist perhaps might have been a psychical experience. However, that psychical phenomenon, if that's what it was, is still for me held within the spirituality of the presence of Christ, on the basis of the constant demand to pray that draws me towards loving, despite my inner chaos. The phenomenon of the organist-less organ playing may not be in itself the presence of Christ, but that presence, that spirituality, was conveyed through the distinctiveness, not the separateness of the psychical experience. I could perhaps describe this life-giving psychical experience as an example not too distant from Christian mysticism, but let me warn you, I am no mystic. It seems to me that the mystical experience enfolds psychical phenomenon within spirituality, the presence of Christ. Christian mysticism, far from being just an extrasensory experience, is by definition about the divine reality of this moment. The divine reality of this moment, the perception of Christ's presence in the ordinariness of this moment, which most of the time I'm too dumb or fragmented to notice, finding God in all things, as St. Ignatius of Loyola put it. In a dream I had years ago, dreaming being for me that deep well of psychical phenomena, I found myself in a large house and I could hear someone playing the piano in the drawing room. I crept in to listen, only to discover I was too late. The piano lid was open. The music on the piano music rest was all open and I could see it very clearly. And a pencil and a rubber revealed that someone had been learning and practicing a piece. The music score on the piano rest was Beethoven's astonishing piano sonata known as the Hammerklavier. If you haven't heard it, make sure you do before you die. Beethoven's sonata, the Hammerklavier. I asked everyone in the house where the pianist had gone, only to discover that she had left and wouldn't be back. I was too late. When I went back to the piano, I stood there with a mixture of regret, but the wistful sense that something of the presence of the pianist was left behind. It was still there. Maybe this too was a psychical experience, but what's important is that it was being gently woken. I was being gently woken to the importance of being aware of the signs of presence that are all around me. Maybe if that awareness became sharper through practice, I might not be too late next time. The spiritual perception of the presence of Christ through the phenomena and with the phenomena, with the psychical. The 20th century theologian and feminist activist Dorothee Söller writes a spiritual perception this way. The question, which is often put to me, do you believe in God, usually seems a superficial one. Well, it always has been. Do you believe in God? Ask Carl Jung what his answer to that is. If it only means that there is an extra place in my head where God sits, I do not emerge unchanged. We should really ask, do you live out God? Do you live him out? That's the much more important question than whether I believe in God. Do I live out God? That would be in keeping with the reality of the experience. The psychical on its own, in my view, is never going to be a fundamentally transformative experience, although it may be awe-inspiring, perhaps frightening, and maybe memorable. When understood within the context of spirituality, then the importance of the experience is only of any significance if it asks me to address the question, as Dorothee Söller put it, do I live out God? In August of 2020, over 300,000 people experienced the terrifying and destructive energy of the explosion in the port of Beirut. You will remember it. Over 200 people lost their lives, which is probably nothing now in comparison to the appalling figures wreaked by COVID-19. The footage of the shock wave, which was disturbingly akin to a nuclear explosion, I can see it now on the television screen, made itself felt not just physically, but psychically to anyone with sensitivity watching on television, let alone in the city of Beirut itself. There's someone I know who lives a life of being a hermit on the Outer Hebrides. She has given her life to deep intercession, which is not simply praying for the suffering, but praying with, indeed more than that, carrying the suffering. The Beirut explosion, she could feel on the remote west coast of the island of Lewis. This has been her pattern of praying for many, many years, costly living out of God, as Dorothee Söller would have put it. I would go so far as to say, I like to think it's probably because of a few women, mostly women that I know who do this, maybe the world is just about stop being blown up. This has been her pattern, as I say, for many, many years. And the psychical experience of feeling the explosion so intimately close, but physically distant, was somehow transfigured in her as she, with Christ, went into the middle of the scene to be with the suffering. After all, that's what the word intercession means. To move into the middle of the suffering in order to love in the carrying of that suffering. I would go so far as to say, don't enter the world of the discipline of intercession unless you're prepared to move right into the heart of that suffering yourself. And it is exhausting. And when a lot of people say they're exhausted by intercession, I say, good, so you jolly well should be. The practice of this approach to intercession, I like to call, perhaps rather clumsily, contemplative intercession. What would happen if the intensity of this psychical identification was practiced more widely in the context of other potential explosive issues? Maybe nuclear disarmament, for example. The apocalyptic stupidity of planning and preparing for nuclear war fighting would be acutely critical and an urgent task. The vocation of living out God at great cost. But the memory of the conflagration in Beirut has begun to fade, hasn't it? Robert Oppenheimer, who was instrumental in the development of the United States atomic weapon, became deeply depressed at the consequences of what he had been working on. However, it was too late. How do you uninvent nuclear weapons, let alone get rid of them? We must live with the virus of strontium-90 as well as the virus of COVID-19. What significance can psychic phenomena have in the face of that constant pandemic cloud over us, if you forgive the allusion. By themselves, regarded as separate experiences, probably little, if anything. Maybe the explosion of COVID-19 is an awakening to how we relate to our diversity of ecosystems, which call for a unitive response and a change of heart, which maybe Joe Biden is just beginning to affect. When I was a parish priest in Dunoon, Argyll, back in the late 1970s, I lived and worked next to the Holy Loch, where Poseidon and Trident missiles, submarines of the US Atlantic Fleet were serviced, maintained, and terrifyingly deployed. I was entertained one lunchtime on board one of those terrifying black bananas. My fear was so strong that I can hardly remember the experience, except this. When I was accompanied back to shore on a tender, I saw a family of 5 standing on the pier. They looked as if they would be from Japan. However, they were covered with mud and had that hung look of despair. As I passed, one said to me, "You must do what you can to stop this." When I stopped and turned, they had gone. Was this a visitation from Hiroshima or Nagasaki? Perhaps. For me, from that experience, the distinctiveness of the psychical experience starts within me, enfolded in a spirituality that is dedicated to the spirit of peace in Jesus Christ. Or as the Franciscans have their version of the Jesus prayer, Jesus, God of peace, have mercy on us. To see my experience as purely a separate psychical one would be to miss the prophetic urgency of the circumstances that we face. The psychic being distinct and within the spiritual is illustrated simply and powerfully in an experience of the writer and Trappist monk Thomas Merton. He writes in his book, Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, he writes this, guilty bystander, sorry. In Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut Street, in the center of the shopping district, I was quite suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all those people, that they were mine and I theirs, that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. There is no way of telling these people that they are all walking around, shining like the sun. Wonderful. This is indeed in stark contrast to my experience on a pier next to nuclear weapons on the River Clyde. Shining like the sun could be described as a psychical phenomenon. And of course, there's an uncomfortable parallel here because, of course, in a nuclear explosion, the explosion is described as 10 times the brightness of the sun, rather ironically. But Merton doesn't leave us there. It is already within a deep spiritual perception that comes from the heart of St. John's Gospel, chapter 17, as there he is in 4th and Walnut Street, everybody one. Father, that they may be one as we are one. So Merton's distinctive psychical experience is intrinsically at the heart of a vast spirituality that no boundary can hold. Not that I would dare suggest a change to our fellowship's name, the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies, but I do wonder if a delicate and tentative suggestion might be if we regarded the title to have at least an interpolation. The Church's Fellowship for Psychical within Spiritual Studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much for that talk. That was most insightful, most useful at explaining the differences, the similarities between the two. I fear that you have done such a fantastic job of explaining to us that I've had no questions come in whatsoever.
Sleep.
So I think greatly, thank you very much for that. However, if anyone does have any questions that they think of for Martin, then please do still send them, and we will find time later on in which to be able to excuse me, able to ask those questions. Now we are due next for a coffee break. However, oh, actually I've just had a question in, Martin. That's great. Question has been asked: how did your relationship with Martin Israel develop? So from a rocky beginning, how did that then carry on?
I think, if I'm honest, Joe, I'm not absolutely sure I can say that it actually ever did. He had an incredible impatience for a lot of Anglican clergy who played at spirituality and didn't actually do it. He was quite impatient with that, really. He was I mean, surprisingly enough, quite, as you probably all know, had this kind of slightly distant and yet somehow or other very paradoxically intense relationship with people. There just wasn't enough time. I think my last experience, I mean, it did change when I myself suffer from quite a lot of depression and anxiety, which is not exactly uncommon, of course, as we're all learning as a result of the mental health of our nation, let alone the world recently. And I did actually have a conversation about depression. And he said, well, if you are going to be a deeply spiritual person and going to be a man of prayer, and you accept the gifts of order in your priesthood, then you are going to experience anxiety and depression. What you must do is be very careful not to make enemies of your depression and anxiety. Befriend your disease, and it will grow less. It's rather like Little Gidding in T.S. Eliot, the wounded surgeon plies the steel that questions the dispenser. So that's the excuse I'm giving myself, Joe. He actually helped me to see that actually the disease I have can actually be transformative, not only for myself, but for others.
Those of us in the fellowship who've been part of the study group that we've been having over the last few months have just been looking at Martin Israel's book, Gethsemane, and I think that comes out a lot in there as well. So yes, thank you for that. Another question we've had in then, you say that Merton had a psychical experience when he experienced union with others. Would you say that was a psychical or a spiritual experience?
If I could sort of take the sort of Aldous Huxley, if I can use Aldous Huxley in this way, the kind of door of perception image. It is, in the psychical, even no matter how destructive it may be, can be a door of perception through which, if one takes it into the heart of praying, and I would say through the heart of the sacraments of the church as well, that then becomes transformative and transfiguring. So I would say, if you like, it was a door of perception that opened him. Now he could have just said, oh gosh, isn't this lovely? I feel one with these people. But he actually sought a much deeper place, which is the union of the divine with humanity. In other words, the incarnation was right there in the heart of Walnut Street, right there in the heart. He didn't just leave it, as it were, at the psychical, but he allowed it to be enveloped by this wonderful universality of the incarnation.
Thank you. And then you mentioned the experiences you had with the organ music, the piano music. How do you go about thinking about the meaning of those? How do you understand the layers of meaning within them?
Well, to be honest, Joe, I'm not sure whether I do, really. And perhaps one only can dip one's toe in the water of them, really, because as the years go by, that's why, by the way, I've got a habit. I don't know whether anybody else has got this habit, but it's probably slightly neurotic. I have always in my pocket a notebook. And so all the experiences I have in a day, you must think, God, this is really very boring. I write down all my experiences, no matter how briefly, in my little journal. Don't worry, it's not Virginia Woolf's journals or anything. I note down my experiences. And so when I look out at the end of the week, that begins to take them into prayer, and it allows them to be deepened and transfigured, I think. That's why not everybody needs to do this, but I find it really helpful, and to jotting it down. And you can use your iPhone in that as well. So I begin to think of it that way. And also the importance, I would say, of spiritual direction. It's when you go to see somebody who is gifted, I use this purely as a metaphor, with a map of the soul, of the inner life, and whom you can trust and lay yourself open to, with great trust and confidentiality. Somebody can then help you to, again, open many more doors of perception through their love and through their care, through the art of spiritual direction, which I'm sure many members of the fellowship have experienced.
Thank you. So the next question has said that this person feels that the Anglican Church, for one, is positive about spirituality, but antithetical about anything psychical in general, and the CFPSS in particular. Have you found similar?
Yes. Yes. I think, again, it's and as it has, I mean, you know, Dean Ing, who wrote that great book called Christian Mysticism, I know it's been bettered since then by Evelyn Underhill and by Frank Happel. But what I would say is that, you know, he was highly, people are very highly suspicious of mystics. You know, there's always a danger that they're going to float off somewhere. You know, please close the windows, we've got a mystic in the room, you know, that kind of stuff. So there's always that kind of sense of that somehow or other, oh, he's a mystic. I don't know about you, I'm a mystic myself. Oh no, but I'm a Methodist. We don't have mysticism or Methodism, or whatever it may be. Or we do things sensibly in the Anglican Church, all these mystical stuff, which completely misunderstands, actually. When you break open your boiled egg in the morning, and you put the first mouth and you just enjoy that, because I love boiled eggs, you see, and you put that's as mystical enough experience for anyone. Thank you very much indeed. But yes, the Church of England was psychical. I'm sorry, I'm trivializing the question. Yes, it's very serious and very important, because they're very worried about organizations that go off and actually they seem to think that we decide what is spiritual, what is psychical, what is not, and that the orders of the church and its synods and the rest of it are somehow or other. So it's a threat to power, frankly, if you want me to be honest.
So then the question is, how could the church go about helping people to better understand the relationship between the psychical and spiritual, as it is such a challenging topic?
I've got bad and good news for you here. As you can hear, I'm a disgustingly opinionated bishop. And anyway, it's probably the safety or cowardice of Zoom that probably does this. Anyway, I would say that the bad news is that mysticism is always going to be regarded as suspicious, always. It always is. Anybody that's got some kind of touch with a kind of sense of sight is going to be, that's why it's dangerous, of course, because it can also, as I was saying, give power, but there is always going to be highly threatening. So that the time when I would I tend to say, Joe, when the Church's fellowship in psychical spiritual studies is taken into the heart of Church of England, beware. A safe distance from organized Christendom is healthy.
Indeed, thank you. So another question then, if what you hear or see or feel coming from the invisible, you feel it as true, should that be enough?
Gosh, what a wonderful question. I'm completely flummoxed by it. The only, a very lame approach, and it's not an answer, is that the truth will set you free, of course. And that truth setting me free, and of course the Psalms, truth within the inner parts, truth, that implies that I think it does, correct me if you think I'm wrong, that implies that I live it out. It's, you know, do I believe in God? No, do I live out God? And the question really matters. Yes, I may have some kind of sense of truth, but it doesn't really have any significance at all as far as I'm concerned unless it's lived out.
Thank you. So you say, sorry.
Yeah. Well, I'm finished. All right.
You say that the spiritual means finding God in all things. So that would then include the psychical. So your own psychical experiences have been positive ones. How do we find God in more negative or disturbing psychical experiences?
I think there are three things there. One is, I think it comes down to, I think, this terrible word discipline, or practice, if that's a better word, coming from the Quakers, because I should suspect there are some members of the fellowship or Quakers, maybe, I don't know. But there's a word practice, the Christian Faith and Practice, very profound book, collection of writings from the great leaders of the Society of Friends. And it's about the Christian practice. And the practice seems to me to be fundamentally important. And that were the disturbing ones. I did actually mention a very disturbing one, which is on the pier at Dunoon, coming off a nuclear submarine. That was a deeply disturbing one. And that I found the Beirut explosion deeply, and still do, deeply disturbing. I find the massing of Russian troops on the border of Ukraine deeply, and psychically disturbing. Now, unless one, I don't mean take it into yourself and become neurotic with it, but placed, as it were, in the crucible of love. That's the great kind of Truman Dickens description of the mysticism of St. John of the Cross, the crucible of love, placing it in the crucible of my praying life with very good friends with whom I can share my vulnerability and my chaos and my neuroses. It seems then that I then begin to see, and after all, the most disturbing experience of all is God in Christ himself, not only murdered and executed, but murdered and executed in the most appalling way. There is no black hole, there is no disturbing experience in the whole universe that can be as black as that. There can't be any. And so if I remember that, if I go into hell, if I go to banish someone into hell, I better make sure I banish myself before anybody else, because Christ has already been there. He's already harrowed hell. So there is no experience, but I need help and love. And I'm very fortunate to be married to a very beautiful woman, Elspeth. But some of you live alone, and that's really hard, really hard. But maybe through Zoom, through telephone, through letter, whatever it may be. But it's so hard. Some of you will have experienced the death of a loved one, where you don't have that kind of conversation. And that becomes, so it's very easy for me to talk about ways into this, but my goodness me. And maybe one of the roles of the church's fellowship is to allow means in which people can honestly come together and say, I'm finding this really hard to cope with. Yeah. Sorry, that was a very lame answer, but it's all I can do.
No, that's fine. So in society, the interest in the psychical and the paranormal is booming business, yet the church is often seen as the last place to get help from those experiencing psychical experiences, especially things like near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, whether in the mystical tradition or in medical professions. Is the church in danger of committing the same mistake as it has done before by brushing away these things rather than engaging in deep theological reflection and possible reinterpretation of scripture through these lenses?
The answer I would give, the approach, I don't have one. But my approach to that would be, I could only actually just give you I promise you, a very brief anecdote. Years and years ago, I met Metropolitan Anthony Bloom. Some of you remember Metropolitan Anthony of Suroge, as you've also known, Russian Orthodox bishop, archbishop indeed, lived in, I think it was Bayswater in London, if I'm right and correct. And I had an opportunity when I was at All Saints Margaret Street to invite him to come and speak, and I met him. And I said to him, Joe, do you know this, Archbishop, I find it very difficult in praying. When I go into pray, all I consider, you've got the four walls around me of when I'm praying, but that's all I experienced, to which Anthony Bloom said, and he wasn't laughing, by the way, well, that's probably all you believe in. And he said, you suffer from the disease of many clergy in the church, many, not all, but I hasten to add, not all, which is not really knowing that the kingdom of heaven is within you. And I think, actually, to be honest to the questioner, I would say that what I perceive in the church is actually an awakening to this, of the importance of the heart and of experience. despite what it may seem like, that there are a remnant of those who I would say do have that sense of the heart. You know, the number of books that are being written now, not only by clergy, but by lay people, you know, Maggie Ross and people like that, on the importance of the prayer of the heart and how very much the church has abdicated, but out of fear rather than anything else, out of fear. Because if you get into very large organizations, you name it, any of the Christendom organizations you care to think of, I'm not picking any particular one, the danger always is that as Kierkegaard pointed out, the great Danish philosopher, is that you then begin to worship the organization and forget actually about the dynamic that lies at the heart. And I think people are beginning now at the heart of the church to take that very seriously, I think. I'm a little bit more hopeful than the questioner. It sounds as if he or she is.
Thank you. Yes, I think the church has perhaps long been a little bit slow to catch up with trends in modern society. So let's hope now that we will start to see a lot more of this coming through.
Yes.
So I will just say we have got time for a couple more questions before we go into the coffee break. For those of you who perhaps aren't quite as familiar with Zoom and don't know how to use the chat function, either on at the top of your screen or at the bottom of your screen, and you may need to move your mouse or touch the screen, you will see a little button that it's marked chat. If you don't see that button, click on more and it should be then underneath there. If you then click on that, you will see it says sent to everyone. If you click where it says everyone, you can then find my name. I will be right at the top as the host of this meeting, and you can then type your question in there. So there is still a time for you to get your questions in before we finish. So perhaps tied into the last few questions then, Martin, why do we worry so much what the church thinks?
A very good question. Why do we? Absolutely. When you think, for example, what the church thinks, not that I know actually, about human sexuality, except setting up another process called living in love and faith, which I'm sure is a very good process. But it's a wonderful dodging thing to do in order to face something that the world itself has faced a long time ago. And so it's again about power and control. Who's in control? We're terribly afraid of it. And so the question is quite right. If we stop worrying about it, then I don't think that the church might waken up to the fact that nobody's paying any attention, really. You know, you're quite right. Well, very few people are paying attention. The important thing is, it seems to me, is taking the sacramental life of the church, taking the Bible seriously, taking the disciplined life of prayer seriously and love. And that is what the body of Christ is about. Everything else, in my view, is peripheral to that.
Thank you. And perhaps finally, unless I guess it, oh no, sorry, I do have another question. Bear with me a second. So the next question, what are some of the books that have really influenced you in this area?
Good question. Gosh, influenced me in this area. Gosh, where do I start? Let me just start with one which the fellowship knows very well, Joe. I think everybody in the fellowship's read, which is Michael Perry's book called Deliverance, which is very, very good. It's very, very practical and to the point. I think the best book that Martin Israel ever wrote in my personal view, is called Summons to Love. That's, I think, probably, it's quite an old one now. I would say that's, I should think a lot of other people in the fellowship would have a much better list than I am. But outside that, I would say this will surprise you. This will really surprise you. And forgive me if I mentioned Wagner's Ring. Now, I know that raises all kinds of problems to do with his politics, etc. But there's something profoundly important in Wagner's Ring, is it raises the whole business of mythology and the world of poetry and art, because the language we all use is very largely, I better be careful what I say in the presence of those who know much more about this than I do. But in the end, all language is a metaphor for something that we do not know how to put in. So all language is a metaphor. The word God is a metaphor for that we do not know how to express. That's why we have the wonderful poetry of Francis Quarles or John Donne, batter my heart, three-person God, those kind of images, which of course, if you take them literally, so I would say myself that if I was asked what I would, the other books I would take were probably, things that open up my mind to that would be, here we go, The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, and of course, somebody, what are you talking about? There's no Christianity. Oh, yes, there is. If you look for it carefully, and remember J.R.R. Tolkien himself went through agonies in the writing of that book. He's a great man of art, fine drawer and painter, as well as a great poet, and a philologist, a great linguist as well. So his book, The Lord of the Rings, is a great story. C.S. Lewis is the same, a great story. I'm not quite so sure about C.S. Lewis, but that's a debate for another time. Something that wakens up the poetry, the imagination inside the heart, I would say, is really important, I would say. And if it was a book, if I was to take one book to go to my grave with, it would be the Oxford Book of English Mystical Verse.
Thank you. Well, it is now 11 o'clock and time for us to move into our coffee break. Martin, there have been another couple of questions come in the chat. They've actually been sent to everyone. If you do get a chance, perhaps you could maybe have a look at them and respond in chat so that we're not delaying our coffee break by any longer. If not, then perhaps you can get back to me with the answers and I will pass them on later on. But again, thank you so much for everything you said to us this morning. It's been a pleasure and a delight to have you with us. So thank you all of you for joining us so far this morning. Please do go and have a break, take some time away from the screen, drink coffee and all those other things that one does in a break. And we will see you back here. Perhaps if we could reconvene, please, at 11:25, and then we can get straight into the Rhoda's talk after that. Thank you all.
Thank you.